The theme of this and the next class, of these two classes, is the default position of contemporary progressives throughout the world. Institutionally conservative social democracy. And I propose to divide the discussion of this default position into three parts. First, the definition of institutionally conservative social democracy, of the social democratic compromise, seen in its reality, not in its self-definition. Second, a view of what has happened to it from its origins to its present circumstance. And third, and this is by far the most important part of the discussion, the exploration of the structural problems and the structural alternatives that lie beyond the horizon of social democracy. The central idea throughout in all these three parts of the argument that I want to explore with you is that social democracy is unable to solve or even to address the central structural problems of the contemporary societies. It is deficient in the imagination and the advancement of structural alternatives. And by structural, I mean, in the first instance, institutional alternatives. And because it is empty of this structural content, because in its very origins it renounced these structural ambitions, it is not adequate to the task. Now, I prepare this discussion by placing before it, before this three-step argument, some remarks about the contemporary circumstance of the left, or more generally of the progressives, amplifying some claims I made in the first class last week. I will stop along the way at each step to invite your engagement, but at any point, if you want to engage, raise your hand, and I'll register it and give you the floor at the next opportune moment. The left, and more generally the progressives, are I claim, lost. I said last week, they have no program. Their program is the program of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. They seek to place a human face on the project of their opponents. And they place themselves, as a result, in a losing position. The agenda is defined by their adversaries. And for the most part, what they propose to do under the aegis of the contemporary diminished form of social democracy is to make the project of their opponents less cruel, to humanize it. And thus they concede at the outset of the dispute the central matter in contention, which is how the constructive energies and genius of society will be aroused, channeled, and organized. They have no message. They have no base. They have no crisis that can serve as the enabling circumstance of transformation. And they have no way of thinking about structural alternatives. So first, on the question of the message. The central point might be summarized in the following way. They have concluded that the state control or direction of the economy through direct governmental production or command of the productive apparatus is not desirable or feasible. But they have come to understand, reluctantly, that compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, that is to say, by progressive taxation and redistributive entitlements, is not enough. Not enough to advance their historical goals, and not enough to secure a strong political position. So one is too much, and the other is not enough. What then should they propose? In this circumstance of programmatic disorientation, their approach to the economy has come to emphasize almost exclusively the demand side of the economy. And they have abandoned the supply side to their opponents. There is, broadly speaking, in the world today, at least in the rich North Atlantic democracies, no well-established, formulated, progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. And that fact becomes of great importance in understanding one of our major themes in the course this semester, which is the fate of the knowledge economy, of what is now the most advanced practice of production. It exists only as a set of fringes that exclude the vast majority of workers and businesses. And the consequence of its confinement is both relative economic stagnation on one side and an aggravation of inequalities that are rooted in these structural divisions of the economy, in the chasm between the advanced and backward parts of the production system. The second problem of the progressives is that in addition to having no message, no programmatic message, other than the message of humanization, they no longer have a base. The historical base of the left-leaning parties in the West, especially in the rich North Atlantic countries, was organized labor, headquartered in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, and especially in mass production industry. This was the core base of the social democratic or labor parties. But mass production industry is in decline. It is no longer the vanguard. And the industrial working class is a shrinking part of the population. in those countries and all over the world. A shrinking part of the population that is no longer seen, and in the end, no longer sees itself as the bearer of the universal interests of society, but as simply one more interest group, one more claimant to the protections and favors of the state. Now, there may be now more petty bourgeois in the world, small business people, than there are industrial proletarians in the traditional sense. And if we define the small business class, the petty bourgeoisie, the class of small-time entrepreneurs and proprietors, subjectively rather than objectively, as an aspiration, it is the vast majority of humanity, aspiring to a modicum of independent prosperity, and attracted by default, because of the absence of other responses to this aspiration, to the formula of traditional, isolated, archaic family business. So the base, the historical base of the left-leaning parties has crumbled under it. And what is it to do? It goes in search of another base. Or it abandons altogether the hope of having a base. It seems that what it would need to do is to conceive of the conditions for the construction of an alliance, of a broad alliance of productivist and worker interests that would go far beyond the limits of the traditional organized industrial working class. But that is an ambitious project that it has on the whole failed not only to implement, but even to undertake. And in each country, it does something else. For example, to some extent in the United States, it replaces this project by what has come to be called identity politics. And in this way further aggravates its estrangement from part of the working class majority. The third element in this quandary of the left, of the progressives, is the absence of a crisis of adequate dimension. Because historically, crisis in the double form of economic ruin and war have been the allies of the progressives. They have marked the moments in which transformation has been easier to come by. Now, these societies have learned to contain economic instability through the counter-cyclical management of the economy. And the wars of today are, on the whole, not like the total war of the mid-20th century, but contained military expeditions. And in most of these countries, including the United States, wars no longer conducted on the basis of universal conscription, but through the instrumentality of an army of poor people hired by the others to fight for them. Now, it's not to say that there haven't been crises of what you could call an intermediate dimension, such as the financial and economic crisis of 2007 to 2009. And it is striking that even though that was the greatest crisis, since the economic crisis of the 1930s, the left or the progressives were, on the whole, unable to benefit from it or to learn from it. And on the contrary, it seems to have benefited more some of their adversaries. A crisis is useful to the agent of transformation, but only to the extent that he has an idea or a project. Remembering Poincaré's principle that chance favors the prepared mind. The fourth aspect of this disorientation of the progressives is that they lack a way of thinking. A way of thinking about structure, about structural discontinuity and structural alternatives in history. I mentioned in the first class last week the intellectual setting of this deficiency. The classic social theories, and especially the one that has exercised the greatest influence on the left, Marxism, had a view of structure. But it was a view entangled in a series of deterministic illusions. That there's a closed list of systems in history, that each of them is an indivisible package, and that there are irresistible laws governing their foreordained succession in history. And all of these ideas about how structural change happens turn out to be false. And in addition to being false, increasingly less believed in. And nevertheless, there is a historical baggage of these illusions that survives. So, for example, there's what I mentioned last week as the binary idea of politics. Politics is either reformist or revolutionary. There are these systems, either you're in them or you're replacing one system by another. What there is not is a way of imagining structure and structural change not as system. Structural change that is fragmentary, which is how structural change really happens in history. On the other hand, in the contemporary social sciences and the established policy discourse, especially in these rich societies, there is a systematic suppression of structural insight. Each social science in a different way, each form of policy discourse in a different way, accepts the horizon of the existing structures and explains why it is what it is, this retrospective rationalization. The theories of justice provide ideas about how these structures are to be rendered less unfair, but not about how alternative structures are to be created. And in this circumstance, in many parts of the world, the leftists often continue to use the vocabulary of Marxism without believing in its assumptions. So, for example, the idea of capitalism as a system, based on all these social theoretical assumptions that have ceased to be believable. No message, no base, no crisis, no way of thinking. Those four circumstances together define this predicament. And that's the position from which we begin in an inquiry like this one, which we have to see clearly. Seeing it clearly is already a part of overcoming it. And having a comprehensive view. So Hegel says, philosophy is revolutionary, even when it appears to be reactionary. And the meaning of this claim is that when we can see a view as a whole, we can begin to imagine its transformation. It doesn't seem to us just the way things are. It is a particular regime of ideas and arrangements. And seen in its entirety, it then begins to become susceptible to fundamental challenge and reimagination. So that's what I wanted to say by way of preface to the discussion of the default position. And it is intended to be a sobering evocation of the real circumstance in which the progressives find themselves. Would you like to discuss some part of that, or should we go on to the, yes? Now, it's very important to speak aloud, not just so the others can hear, but so that your comment can be heard in the videotape.
So you mentioned earlier that one of the reasons that the left has no longer a message and no basis is the decline in mass production and thus the shrinking amount of production.
Yes.
So don't you think, Professor, that the proletariat and the left in general has been always, recently since the World War II, the victim of incessant hostile policy from liberal democracy and corporate capitalism? For instance, the infringement of civil rights and labor unions.
Of course.
As an example. And I can also illustrate one recent example happening in France, one of the historic countries in the social movement, how they are reacting to the recent movement of the yellow vests happening in France. And
Yes.
How do you react to that?
Well, why does that contradict any of the things I said? It's true. That's life. That's politics. You have enemies; they attack you. You expect them to be passive, so you have a project, and what can't happen is that you're just on the defensive position. So you're trying to advance an agenda, and as you try to advance it, you're attacked. But if you're attacked and you don't have an agenda, if you don't have a strong agenda, then your situation is much worse. Then there's a sense in which you can't win. All you can do is to normalize or improve the project of your adversaries. So we're full of examples in the contemporary world in which the left-leaning parties are elected, and in office, in effect, they implement some variant of the project of their adversaries. That's much more fundamental and disturbing, much more subversive of their historical project than they're being attacked in the course of trying to advance a project. Yes?
I was just wondering, so when you were talking about the progressive lack of base, you mentioned identity politics. And
Yes.
Identity politics aggravates the progressive movement's estrangement from the working class majority.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you could define, like, what's your definition of identity politics?
Well, this would be a long discussion. We have to enter the discussion of American politics, which I would like to do as an example at a certain moment, but I hesitate to do it at this point, and in which we're speaking generally. I will say this, that the problems that are now described as identity politics, progressive politics as a coalition of minorities and their virtual representatives were already prefigured in American history by the more fundamental problem of the relation between race and class in American history. So that's one way to approach the issue of identity politics in the United States. And you could distinguish broadly four main positions about race and class in the American evolution. So one has been a subaltern position, a position of acceptance of a subordinate position, represented, for example, by Booker T. Washington in the period after the Civil War. Then there's been a secessionist position, often not literally intended, that is going back to Africa, but as the preface to some form of internal secession or internal exile into a separate world. Interestingly, this separate world, when it has been presented by a series of activists going up to Farrakhan, has many of the social and moral characteristics of what I call the subordinate position, a world of small-scale proprietors, craftsmen with norms of moral respectability. Then briefly, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there has been a reconstructive position that tried to marry race and class. Starting in the South, it was a very brief interlude, and it was suppressed. And what has prevailed has been then a fourth approach, which is the integrationist orthodoxy in the United States, which treats race as a threshold issue separate from class, represented by policies such as affirmative action. And it has had a series of perverse consequences for the progressives. It has separated the mass of poor blacks from their leadership. It has generated benefits that are in inverse proportion to the need for them. That is, it has most benefited the black bourgeoisie, to a lesser extent, the organized working class, especially in public employment, but least of all, the underclass stuck in the unstable part of the labor market. And the third defect is that it has offended the white working class majority of the country that see themselves as the victims of a sanctimonious conspiracy of the propertied classes with the self-appointed representatives of these minorities. So this has been a heavy price to pay. And it is, in a way, a prefigurement of what we now know as identity politics, in which this same principle has now been generalized in some way. Now, I said I wouldn't speak about American politics, but I'm already speaking, and I just add one more element, so we can see the connection between the American situation and this discussion of the left. After all, we are now in the United States, and it seems fair to give some weight to this example. The basic formula of conservative statecraft in the United States in the second half of the 20th century was the combination of material concessions to the moneyed interests, the interests of the moneyed classes, with non-material moral concessions to the religious and moral sensibilities of the moneyless classes. in a circumstance in which the putative Progressive Party no longer seemed to represent the interests of the working class majority, especially of the white working class majority. And that's what made it possible for power to be won and held by the conservative forces in the United States for several decades. There was then a defect in this system of conservative statecraft, that it was itself unable and unwilling to serve the wider interests and aspirations of this working class majority. But in the face of its failure, the progressives continued to be without a project, other than, for example, to genuflect to progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. So then there's a second wave of stepping into the vacuum that the progressives had abandoned. And the second wave is this plutocratic populism, which suffers essentially from the same problem, that it promises finally to represent the interests of this dispossessed white working class majority, but it doesn't, or it does only to a very limited extent. So by imposing restraints on migration in the interests of unskilled workers in the United States, and by adopting a program which it shares with the lost progressives, which is defend declining mass production industries. A few more years for the Rust Belt, but has no future, no plan to convert it into something else. So once again, there's this wave, this second wave. What an opportunity for the progressives if they had a program, but they don't. So this is just a polemical way of connecting the American circumstance to this discussion I just had about the predicament of the progressives. So in general, what I would say is that this circumstance that I've described is a worldwide circumstance. But in each country, it appears in a special form, according to the circumstances and the history of that country. So just now in our exchange, I've been discussing the American variation on this worldwide predicament. It helps to understand its true character and to understand that it's not just a national idiosyncrasy, that it is a worldwide problem, because then we can distinguish in the problem what is central from what is peripheral. Yes?
So in your kind of conception, you seem to have consciously coupled the center-left and anything further left of that, in your description of progressives as one. It seems to me that there's potentially more in common with between the center-left and the right than there is between the center-left and anything further left of that has its own intellectual and political tradition that's separate from the center-left. So I'm curious why those two are so connected, because it seems that a lot of your sort of analysis is based on those two being, if not interchangeable, being linked.
Well, I would go even further than you're saying. So on the definition of left, or the division between left and right that I proposed last week, almost all the so-called leftists or progressives are conservative, because it's an idea of equality combined with institutional conservatism or skepticism. So its pragmatic residue, the residue of that sum of the egalitarian commitment with the institutional submission, is the narrowing of the focus to compensatory redistribution by taxes and by entitlements, which is relatively ineffective. So in their method, which abandons structural alternatives, and in their understanding of the goal, they are conservative. So who's leftist? So it would be the forces that would represent this alternative. But they're not clearly defined in most countries. So who are they? They're the leftover Marxists with these 19th century ideas about another system. There's a system, socialism, that will replace capitalism. So this program is not there. And there's a problem in the way we typically understand this ideological spectrum, because it's related to the dilemma about programmatic argument with which I began the first class. The problem is to think that more left is just more radical in the sense of more extreme. But it's not like that, because the issue is what's the content of the direction. And any direction worth thinking about and pursuing can be understood at points relatively close or relatively far away. So what often happens is that these supposedly more leftist agents, political agents, are in a way disguising the absence of a real project by a profession of willingness to be extreme. Extremism, radicalness, in the sense of let's go further, let's demand more, it does not in itself create the fertile distinction. As a result, the leftists find themselves often in the situation of King Lear, when he says, I shall do such things, yet what they are I know not, but they will be the terrors of the earth. And this is the situation. Yes.
I'm trying to better understand your diagnosis of the flaws, just thinking about structural change.
Yes.
Is it that the left should be more open to just greater discontinuity, whether or not we can explain it, or that there's some separate, richer causality that economists, lawyers go down the list of social sciences left?
So it's fair to wonder about that, because what I said was an allusion to a long set of social theoretical debates that I didn't go into. But the basic idea is that in Marxism, and more generally in much of classical European social theory, there is a structural notion. So in Marx, remember, the beginning is his criticism of English political economy. The English political economists treated as universal and eternal laws of the economy what were only the regularities of a particular regime. That's what's so exciting and innovating as a theoretical paradigm in that work. So it's denaturalizing the arrangements and treating them as an artifact. And because they are an artifact, something that can be replaced. But the problem then is that idea that it is a definite structure is then surrounded or corrupted by a set of false assumptions. And I listed three sets of them. The idea that there's a closed menu of regimes in history, like feudalism, capitalism, socialism. The idea that each of them is an indivisible system. If they are to change, they change all at once, being replaced by another system. And then the idea, the third set, that they're laws of historical transformation. In other words, history has a script. And we don't need to have a project. History has a project for us. And the punishment for deviating from this project is historical defeat. Each of these bad ideas has a rich set of practical consequences. So it's not as if the limitations of these ideas were not today widely understood. They are understood. And that's why it's so hard, even for would-be Marxist intellectuals, really to believe in the assumptions of this theory. But they continue to use its vocabulary. So there seems to be some form of self-deception, and which makes it hard then to do what we need to do, to think about structural alternatives in a fragmentary way, to think about them structurally, to define alternative directions. That's the problem if you come from Marxism. Now, consider the problem if you come from the other direction. The other direction was contemporary social science, but the other direction is just also the ordinary policy discourse, as it is represented, for example, in the newspapers. So it's very clear in the United States that the idea is that in politics, there's like a heap of issues, of discrete issues. And then there are practical solutions to these issues. But they're not organized into a contrast of directions in which initial steps prefigure alternative structures in the future. So that's another way of defeating or suppressing the structural imagination. So that's just a brief response to you about what I had in mind, that there's this intellectual confusion, right? And you remember the narrator in Proust says, "We are friends with those whose ideas are at the same level of confusion as our own." And that is the fundamental principle of alliance and antagonism in politics. Have a bunch of confused people, but they have the same confusion, and they're joined together not just by their interests and ambitions, but also by their confusions in this situation that I was describing. Yes?
I was just wondering, do you think that part of the stagnation of thought in this area is because of some trauma of like violence that accompanied the last epoch of like great imagination?
Well, it's true that the ideological calamities of the 20th century are used to discredit any attempt to promote alternative structures. But again, I don't think that's a large part of the explanation of why we're in this situation or why the left is in this situation. The social democratic compromise, this default position, began to be imagined, to be formulated ideologically before the apogee of communism in Russia, before the fascist and Nazi regimes in Europe, and so forth. And it is true that those regimes then used this vocabulary of systems, these indivisible packages. So the dangers and illusions of these adventures in the construction of different systems can then be used, as you're suggesting, to combat or discredit a fundamentally different project, which is the project of creating structural alternatives step by step in a fragmentary form. The crucial imaginative advance, which I cannot emphasize too often, is to combine the structural aspiration or direction with the fragmentary method. That changes everything. Because our traditional assumption, coming from this background of social theory, is that if an initiative is profoundly transformative, it must change a whole system. And if it doesn't change a whole system, then it's some kind of playing for time. It's a management of the existing system. That idea is a legacy of Marxism, which influences the whole mentality of the progressives. That's the idea of, since we're not doing revolution, since it's not in the cards, if it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. Let's humanize this thing here that we have without reimagining it or reshaping it. So the default position of the contemporary progressives, in 3 steps. The conception, the definition of this default position in its historical reality, not just as a set of ideological abstractions. What has happened to it and what we can learn from what has happened to it. And then finally, what it denies us. The range of structural problems that it is unable to solve, and that would represent then the agenda of a contemporary progressive position. So that third element is then a bridge between this discussion of the default position and the main content of the remainder of the course, which is the exploration of alternatives in a series of domains: economic, political, and educational. Let me begin by making a remark about the favorite regime in the world today. So you could say it's Scandinavian social democracy. If the world could vote, it would not vote to become the United States. It would vote to become Sweden. But not the real Sweden. This fantastical Sweden. So, and not the Sweden that exists at this moment, because the Sweden of this moment has converted to some version of neoliberalism. But the historical Sweden of the many decades after the Second World War. In the real Sweden, there were decades of conflict over access to political power and economic advantage. In a country that had begun as very poor, as a kind of peasant society, and in which a small number of rich families controlled a large part of the production system. Dynastic plutocracy. So there was a conflict, and this conflict ended in a compromise between the Swedish state and these plutocratic dynasties, in which the plutocratic dynasties ceded some of their economic power, but remained in place, and remained, in some sense, in control of a very large part of the production system. Now, then, so that's the narrative. And then comes the epilogue. The epilogue is this welfare state, based on a high level of taxation and of redistributive social entitlements, paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. The basic attitude in the world with respect to Scandinavian social democracy is that it wants the epilogue. But the epilogue is just the end of this story that it doesn't see. In this story of conflict, of institutional invention and adjustment, ending in this homely ad hoc compromise between the state and the plutocratic dynasties. So that's just like a little version. It's part of this confusion about the reality of what has happened in the world. So what then is social democracy? We can begin to understand it as a kind of bargain or compromise. A compromise that began to develop in the decades before the Second World War and was then perfected in the 3 decades after the Second World War. By the terms of this compromise, the forces that challenged the established organization of production, the economy, and of power, politics, renounced this challenge. And it's as if in exchange for this abdication, the state was allowed to acquire a triple power. First, the power to regulate the economy, the established form of the market economy, more intensively. Second, the power to attenuate the inequalities generated in that economic order by retrospective redistribution through progressive taxation and social entitlements. And third, the power to manage the economy countercyclically through fiscal and monetary policy. And that then is the regulated market economy, or the social democratic compromise that has become the default position of the progressives. So what was central to this compromise was the retreat from a wider agenda of structural ambition. That is its very nature, particularly with respect to the organization of the market economy, but more generally with respect to the whole organization of society. And then this retreat from structural ambition is combined with the impulse to manage and to humanize. So it will turn out, and this is the essence of my argument in further steps of this analysis, that the contemporary societies now face a series of structural problems that cannot be resolved or even addressed within the limits of this social democratic compromise. And that then is the opportunity for the progressives. But it requires a project and a way of thinking. Now let's go further and develop this understanding of the social democratic compromise, what I'm also calling institutionally conservative social democracy, into a view of its crucial defining arrangements. So you could say that historical social democracy, the social democracy raised up in the aftermath of the Second World War, consisted of a combination of 3 sets of arrangements. This is not how the Social Democrats would define themselves. So it's an unsentimental understanding of historical social democracy. The first set of arrangements were arrangements that generated safeguards against economic insecurity at the cost of tolerating or even developing divisions between insiders and outsiders, between incumbents and upstarts or challengers. Now, most notably divisions in the labor market, between workers with stable jobs and organizations, typically in the capital-intensive sectors of the production system, and later in public employment. And other workers who were in the capital-starved part of the economy or worked without these guarantees and did not have this quasi-tenure status. And to some extent, the division between insiders and outsiders, between incumbents and challengers, was also extended into the market for corporate control. So, historical social democracy, in a whole set of ways, privileged those who controlled established business against challenge in the capital markets. So that was the first set of arrangements. The second set of arrangements is what we sometimes call social contract. And it consisted in the orchestration by government of deals between big business and organized labor, labor in the privileged part of the labor market, about the distribution of benefits and costs resulting from different macroeconomic policies. So every macroeconomic direction, every strategy of growth, every way of conducting fiscal and monetary policy establishes consequences, either beneficial or detrimental, for different groups in society. And what these social contracts did was to represent a deal between the most powerful interests, which were the most organized ones, of business and of labor, about how to distribute the benefits and the costs. And the idea is there has to be a deal for us to advance. The third set of arrangements defining historical social democracy was the creation of a high level of social entitlements. And these social entitlements would often be universal, not just for the group of insiders in the labor market. Paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially, more recently, by the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax. So the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax is the ideal limit of a tax in the sense that it is completely neutral, if there are no exceptions to it, in relation to the system of relative prices. And it allows then the state to maximize the tax take while minimizing the disturbance to established incentives to save, invest, and employ. And then all of that money is used by the state to develop the high level of entitlements. Now, this third set of arrangements is connected with what is indisputably the greatest achievement of historical social democracy. The greatest achievement of historical social democracy is to have established a very high level of investment in the capacities of people on the basis of this high level of entitlement reliant on a high tax take. And where it was most successful, it has never been undone. So successive conservative governments in the home ground of European social democracy have never made a significant dent on the high level of the tax take or on its use to establish a high level of universal entitlements. So that's, as it were, the good side of historical social democracy. The bad side, we'll see later, is the consequences of this abdication of structural ambition. So what has happened in a nutshell? It's very simple. What has basically happened is that under the weight of criticism and pressure, economic and political pressure, social democracy has given up the first set of arrangements, the better to preserve the third. So it has begun to subvert the distinction between insiders and outsiders. Its characteristic project is advanced under the label of flexibility in the labor market. And flexibility can then become a euphemism for radical economic insecurity. And the social compacts or contracts have on the whole been abandoned as well. So social democracy retreats to the last line of defense, which is the maintenance of the high level of entitlements on the basis of the regressive taxation of consumption. So of course we would have to have an understanding of why this happened. And there would be many elements in that explanatory account. So there was a criticism, an attack, that the division between insiders and outsiders was both inefficient and unfair. It was inefficient in imposing a series of rigidities that exacted an intolerable economic cost, especially in the context of the new form of globalization and worldwide competition. And unfair because it promoted the interests of these minorities, of what became a minority of insiders. But another vital part of the explanation is that the underlying practice of production, which was mass production, traditional industry, began to decline. There was a change. There was a succession in the practice of production. That's related to the left parties losing their core historical base. In a context in which hundreds of millions of Chinese and Indian workers paid at much lower wages come onto the world labor market. So then we get the characteristic project of today. The characteristic project of today is to liberalize social democracy, to combine the social protection of the Europeans with the economic flexibility of the Americans, to make social democracy more liberal in the classic European sense of liberal. Liberal not as progressive, but liberal as flexible as free market. And on the other side, social liberalism, to make liberalism more social. That's the characteristic project. That's the hegemonic project. And it can be seen in two ways. It can be seen as a development of the historical project of social democracy, or it can be seen as a hollowing out of social democracy, a reduction of its content to a minimalist basis. And that's the position that is now occupies the center of the political and ideological space in these advanced societies. Evidently, it has been insufficient to address the problems of these societies and to ensure the working class majorities in them that they will be advanced. And if it weren't insufficient, there wouldn't be what we have seen, which is the rise of these right-wing populisms throughout the North Atlantic world. Now, there's then the initial presentation of social democracy and of what has happened to it. And I want to go further in the account of what has happened to it, but first to stop and ask for your further engagement. Yes?
I just want to, at least at a high level, better understand your critique, the differences between this more liberalization of social democracy and, I guess, sort of a deeper, richer experimentation that you seem to be advocating. There's a difference between sort of removing constraints negatively and more affirmatively sort of planting different obstacles. Is that because both?
Well, let's take an example. Let's take an example which will be central in the arguments of this course. The example of the fate of the knowledge economy. So, mass production declines. Countries are deindustrializing all over the world. And there's a new advanced practice of production. Radically innovative and experimental, dense in knowledge and in technology. And almost universally, in every part of the economy, confined to a fringe that excludes the large majority of workers and of firms. That's an example of a structural problem, the hierarchical segmentation of the economy. So what would count as a structural project with respect to that problem would be to transform this insular vanguard into a more inclusive vanguard. To see under what conditions, by what changes in education and in institutions, the knowledge economy could cease to be quarantined in these narrow fringes and be radicalized and disseminated. So this is a problem of vast consequence. The confinement of the knowledge economy has consequences for economic growth. If the most productive practice is denied to the majority of workers and firms, we should expect that there will be a limit, a slowdown in the rise of productivity. And when there is less economic growth, all the other problems of society, including its problems of inequality, become much harder to solve. And by the same token, this confinement of the knowledge economy to the exclusive fringes then aggravates economic inequality because there are vast distances between the advanced and the backward parts of the production system. So then the recipe of historical social democracy is attenuate those inequalities after the fact, retrospectively, by progressive taxation and by social entitlements. But if economic growth slows and if the inequalities deepen, retrospective and compensatory redistribution will not be up to the task. It will not be adequate. We'll have to think differently. We'll have to think of some way of influencing the primary distribution of economic advantage, not just the derivative or secondary distribution, which is the one we achieve through this after-the-fact correction. That's the sense of this contrast between the structural and the non-structural. And the knowledge economy issue is simply the most salient example of what we find reenacted in every aspect of social and economic life. So if the point of social democracy was to retreat from this agenda of structural change, now we find problems that seem impossible to address except by reopening the terms of that compromise, but no longer reopening them under the dispensation of the classical ideological ideas about systems. So that would say, well, this is capital. This is the essence of capitalism. Capitalism evolves toward financialization, oligopolies, inequality. The solution is to replace it by another system. And then we're back to this idea of the systems, which we can't get to, either intellectually or practically. Yes?
You spoke about social entitlements, and I'm assuming that this is, we could, as in other words, we would say welfare state, the crown jewel of social democracy.
Yes.
Achievement of
It is.
social democratic forces. Now, in Europe, I feel that the welfare state is under double pressure. On the one hand, the political forces that historically were supporting and enhancing this welfare state have either conceded to third way assumptions and they have lost ground, or they are no longer convinced about the necessity of having these social entitlements in societies. And the second pressure, which is very pertinent, is the fact that we have aging populations, and this increases the cost of welfare state. So we have this paradox, which is that even though the welfare state is reducing, or parts of it are commodified and given to the
Yes.
private sector, the cost of sustaining this welfare state
Yes, of course.
remains stable. Now this is a jigsaw puzzle, because on the one hand, we need to preserve these entitlements, and on the other hand, there's an almost lost battle in industrial
Yes.
level where the opponent is much more effective on convincing the masses that welfare states are no longer sustainable
Yes.
or desired.
Yes.
How do we address this conundrum?
Well, it's a clear implication of the argument so far that I want to develop, that's a puzzle that can't be solved. On the terms on which you stated it, it's insoluble. So to solve it, two things would be necessary. One would be a sustained acceleration of economic growth, because there's no example of successful structural transformation in a circumstance of enduring economic stagnation. And the second element for a solution would be to influence what I just call the primary distribution of advantage, the one that's being created by this hierarchical segmentation of the economy. So that relates to all of the substantive issues that I want to discuss. The relation of the advanced part of production to the rest, the relation of finance to the real economy, and the relation of labor to capital. It's only on those terms that the problem can begin to be solved. On the terms you stated, it can't be solved. And it's not surprised that it's not being solved. And so that's how I'm representing the situation. Now, the problem then is if you begin to address those problems, which your description of the puzzle excludes as beyond the horizon, it will at first seem that this is too tall a mountain for us to climb. The task is too great, and we're not up to it, politically, intellectually, in any way. So then it becomes essential to break that task up into pieces or parts so that the seemingly unapproachable task becomes feasible. That's the general character of the discussion that is prefigured here. But in your statement of the crisis of the welfare state in the home ground of social democracy, you're absolutely right. Now, I do want to discuss two of the terrains in which this conflict is taking place today, because that's part of this discussion of what's happened to social democracy. The policies with respect to the labor market and the policies with respect to taxation and welfare. But someone else had his hand up here. Does someone else want to speak? Yes.
So you mentioned that social democracy abdicated its structural ambition.
Yes.
Considering that the innovative institutions, both national and international, that it helped establish after World War II, can't we consider that at least initially it had a structural vision,
Did it ever have a structural ambition? Not really on these terms, right? Because it had a project, which was the creation of this regulated market economy, then this humanized form of the market economy. In that sense, it had a structural ambition. But it was founded on the retreat from wider structural ambitions, to create a different kind of market economy, to create a different kind of democracy. That's what it retreated from. And what I'm saying is that we can't begin to solve any of these problems, like the one that was just described about the welfare state, without undoing this retreat. But we have to undo it in new terms, not in the terms of going back to the ideological contests of the 19th and 20th centuries. That's what's complicated. So, as I said in the first class, how are we going to be able to think and act structurally with respect to structure without succumbing to structural dogmatism, as these agents of transformation did in the past 2 centuries? Now, two of the characteristic concerns of this liberalized social democracy are the reformation of the labor market and the program of corrective redistribution by tax and transfer. So first, on the labor market, the most exemplary project of liberalized social democracy in this updated so-called Nordic form, has been what is labeled flexicurity. So the basic idea is, instead of tying benefits and rights to the possession of a particular job, of a specific niche in the production system, we make them universally portable, guaranteed to everyone, belonging to the person as part of his fundamental endowment, and capable of being taken from one position in society to another. And then in return for the creation of that vested right, of that universal safeguard, we can flexibilize the labor market without allowing flexibility to degenerate into radical economic insecurity. Now, this is an admirable program, and in some sense, it must be part of any progressive alternative, in a wide enough sense. Now, let me say what I mean. So the progressive on this view must want society to be open to alternatives and to experiments. But the counterpart or the condition for this wider plasticity in social and economic life must be that the individual be rendered secure, unafraid, and capable in a haven of vital protected interests and endowments. So This relates to the very essence, to the inner nature of our conception of fundamental rights and what they are for. So a fundamental right can be understood at two levels. First, there's the method. What is the method? The method is we take something out of the agenda of short-term politics, for example, by entrenching it in the Constitution, or by treating it as part of the permanent endowment of the individual worker and citizen. And at the same time, we extend the agenda of politics. We take something out of the agenda to make the agenda bigger. That's the method. And what's the point? The point can be revealed by a metaphorical comparison of the nature of a fundamental right to the relation between a parent and a child. So the parent says to the child, I love you unconditionally. On the basis of my unconditional love, you have a place in the world. Now go out and raise a storm in the world. That's the fundamental idea. That's the point. You're rendered secure and capable so that you can shake the world up. Now, what we have, of course, in the traditional discourse of fundamental rights is only the part about the unconditional guarantee. The part about the storm is characteristically missing. But in any acceptable version of a progressive alternative, we need both parts. And so this is the sense in which I'm saying something like this idea in a more generalized and deeper form would have to figure in any acceptable progressive alternative. But the endowment then, this universal endowment, these portable rights, are not a substitute for a wider structural program. And if they don't develop as part of a wider structural program, containing elements such as the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy, they cannot be successful. They cannot achieve their supposed goals. So take the example of flexicurity. Suppose the following factual situation. You have this reform of flexibility in the labor markets and this idea that there'll be the buildup of these endowments. But first, economic growth stagnates. There's a slowdown in the rise of productivity, affecting the fiscal situation of the state. Inequalities deepen because the transition from one practice of production to another widens the gap between the advanced and the backward parts of the production system, worsening the situation in the original, in the fundamental distribution of economic advantage. And a large part of labor becomes precarious, is undertaken under conditions of precarious contractual employment. This shift in the change of practices of production has been associated all over the world with the increase in the part of the labor force that is precarious, temporary contracts of different kinds without guarantees. Now, in that situation, characterized by these three sets of facts, flexicurity is very unlikely to be able to achieve its intended effects. It will be overwhelmed. It will be overwhelmed by these circumstances. So you see that this is an example of social democracy trying to regenerate itself through this liberalization. And this particular project is ingenious and beneficial in many ways, but it is not a surrogate for the missing productivist program, for the progressive approach to the supply side, for the mastery of the organizational problems that have to do with the relation of the advanced and backward sectors, the relation of finance to the real economy, and the relation of capital to labor. And even on the narrow ground of the employment situation, given the increase in the portion of the labor force that is in precarious employment, one would have to have a political and legal response to this new economic reality. Traditional labor law developed to deal with the realities of mass production. A large, stable labor force assembled in large productive units like factories under the aegis of big corporations that maintain that stable labor force. But that's no longer the situation that prevails in the world. And we have the reorganization of labor on a global scale on the basis of decentralized networks of contractual arrangements. They represent a contemporary version of the putting out system described by Marx in the early chapters of Capital. Labor is not conducted on the basis of stable employment. So what we think of as the natural form of the organization and representation of labor, which is the existence of the stable labor force and then collective bargaining on that basis, may turn out to be a relatively brief interlude from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th, between two longer periods in which labor is organized on the basis of these decentralized and unstable contractual arrangements. So even before we have a larger structural project for the reformation of the market economy and of the production system, we need to deal with this reality. So what would that mean with respect to the situation of precarious employment? It would mean that traditional labor law is no longer enough. We need, alongside traditional labor law for stable employees, a second set of labor laws to deal with this new reality. The second set might be organized, for example, on the principle of a kind of sliding scale. And it would say, these workers should also be organized and represented. And we should use the contemporary technologies to make that possible, of communication, of information. And to the extent that they are not organized and represented, there should be direct legal intervention in the employment relation to prevent flexibility from becoming simply a facade for radical insecurity. And here's an example of what such a form of direct legal intervention would be. Just an example among many. It would say there has to be price neutrality between labor performed under unstable conditions and analogous labor performed under conditions of stable employment. The business can flexibilize, but the flexibility, the flexibilization, can't be a pretext simply for depressing the wage, the return to labor. There has to be equivalence. And then we would develop, as the lawyers do, a series of standards to implement that practice. Now, that's just a little example of how we might begin to imagine a series of bridges between this narrow idea of flex security and the missing structural program. And what I'm trying to suggest by way of giving this example is that we shouldn't think of the structural alternatives as all or nothing. That's not the way to think of them. It's a direction. And we can begin the direction from the bottom up, from the inside out, by developing little bridges like this one, if we have a transformative ambition. So even the characteristic programmatic repertoire of liberalized social democracy can serve as a point of departure for a series of broader structural endeavors. Okay, let me ask you then about that particular set of problems about the labor market, because I think it is the most telling instance of this project of liberalized social democracy. Yes.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it seems like the program you're putting forward, at least on this kind of labor, the specific labor example
Yes.
you just gave, is a very legalistic, in a way, very kind of liberal recommendation. And I have a hard time even conceptualizing its implementation because we have so many labor laws that are either unenforced or unenforceable.
Yes.
That just adding another veneer of sort of liberal law seems kind of not even close to capable of doing what you're setting out to do, but even to move to create a path forward if we can't even enforce very limited labor laws we have now.
So let me step back and say, give the broader, how I understand the broader world context of the debate today in labor law with respect to these new economic realities. So there are basically two positions in the debate. One position says we shouldn't tolerate these forms of unstable employment. This is the position which in many countries, less in the United States, is taken by the leaders of the labor movement and the representatives of traditional labor law. All of these forms of stable employment should be decreed illegal because they are a fraudulent circumvention of the labor laws. So that's one position. The problem with that position is that it is trying by decree to suppress a change in employment practices that is intimately related to the change in the practice of production. This new economy is not organized the way in which mass production was organized. It cannot be conducted on the basis simply of this stable labor force in large productive units. So, and we cannot simply by decree suppress the economic reality. The alternative position, which is the neoliberal position, says we have to flexibilize. And flexibility means breaking through these guarantees and allowing these anomalous forms of employment to proliferate. So another example would be self-employment as a disguised form of wage employment without wage benefits, as in the situation of Uber drivers. And if we then generalize that second response, we allow the idea of flexibility to become a euphemism for just generalized economic insecurity, depressing the position of labor vis-a-vis capital. So we need a third position. And the third position has to be one that doesn't attempt to suppress by decree the new productive realities, but seeks to master them in some way. And then we can debate about the best way of mastering them. I just gave an example, but there'd be many others. But what seems to me to be crucial is that we take this third position. The first position is first of all hopeless, impractical, in my view. And second, in most countries in the world, in the interest of the organized minority and to the detriment of the disorganized majority of workers. So it's a set of guarantees, but guarantees that are exclusively possessed by what is a smaller and smaller minority of the labor force. So on both those grounds, it can't be accepted. But the neoliberal alternative is then to allow the depression of the situation of labor. So it's simply that there's a new reality, we have to master it. And to say it's legal or legalistic is simply to say that every response generated in thought and in politics ultimately has to be expressed as law. Then if it's an isolated initiative, if it's not part of a more general movement, if it's just a technocratic fix-it, then, as you suggest, it's less likely that it can be sustained and, in fact, enforced. But the addition of this element begins to change the liberalized social democracy idea of flex security into something broader. And that's all that matters in my mind in this argument. Not whether I don't think of it as the resting place or the ideal solution. The issue is whether it's a direction, whether it's part of a movement from where we are to where we would rather be. And by the nature of the case, we can discuss the different possible ways of doing that. That was the sense of it. Yes?
Your idea of flex security seems to resemble the universal basic income in terms of guaranteeing people basic ability to provide for themselves.
Yes, let me just interrupt one thing. It's not my idea.
Oh, sorry.
It's their idea. So it's the idea of the Danes and the Finns and the Dutch and so forth.
So is it generally envisioned as kind of monetary transfer, or is it more of benefits?
Well, it can take many forms, of course. So a characteristic form is the one you say of the guaranteed income, but there are other forms it takes. But the main thing is that the guarantees against insecurity, beginning with unemployment, are then generalized. They're part of the endowment of the worker citizen, separate from the active possession of any position in the production system. So he doesn't have the right, for example, because he used to have a certain job. He has the right just because he's a worker and a citizen. And then the notion is that justifies the flexibilization of the labor market. And the argument I made is that it's not enough. It's not enough to justify it. And if it's all by itself, if it's isolated, then it is likely to degenerate into some kind of fig leaf and to be just a euphemism for the insecurity. Yes?
I think one element to this that I haven't heard you mention that would seem to be perhaps like the most important when we're thinking about a broader idea of flexibility would be the idea of sovereignty. Because if we're thinking about a worker citizen in the coming 21st century, a lot of these worker citizens are going to be displaced and have to cross national and sovereign borders. So is part of your idea of a separate, a second layer of labor law, a global, a element of law that transcends sovereign national boundaries, or is the idea of the movement to build these?
Well, that introduces a whole other discussion, right? A whole other discussion about labor mobility, about the direction of globalization. I don't know whether this is the moment to signal toward that discussion, but I will say that all of these debates in the national context have as a counterpart debates about the direction of globalization. And there is something very fundamental, analytically and theoretically, which is instead of saying that the central question in the ideological dispute is how much market versus state, or how much globalization versus national autarky, we say, no, that's not the question. The question is which market, which globalization, which democracy. It's not the hydraulic model in which it's just more state, less market, more market, less state, synthesis of market and state. Now, the present form of globalization in the world is developed under the aegis of an idea of institutional maximalism. Under the WTO treaties and the multilateral trade treaties, it wants to incorporate into the conception of a market economy a particular version of a market economy, and then to impose the acceptance of that version as a condition for participation in the world trading system. So, for example, it wants to outlaw under the label subsidies all the forms of strategic coordination between governments and firms that the countries that are now rich use to become rich. A corollary of this established form of globalization that goes in the direction of your issue of labor mobility is the radically differential treatment of the mobility of capital and of things on one side and the mobility of people on the other. So the idea is capital and things should become as free as possible to move as soon as possible. But people should be imprisoned in the nation state or in blocks of relatively homogeneous nation states, such as the European Union. Now, of course, universal labor mobility could not be established. There's nothing that would be more revolutionary or be more sure to undermine all the governments in the world. But we can imagine a different form. We can imagine a form of globalization which is based on institutional minimalism. It says, we want the greatest openness in the world with the least possible restraint on the institutional experiments needed to transform the market economies internally. And instead of saying that things and money will have all freedom to move and labor will have none, we want things, money, and people to gain freedom together in small cumulative steps. And then we have a different kind of globalization. Now, how is such a different kind of globalization ever likely to arise in the world? Certainly not as the gift of an enlightened cosmopolitan elite to the underlying states. It will arise only if it's taken by storm. That is, if there are down below strong national projects that hit against the limits imposed by the established form of globalization. And then allied nations below demand and force a change in the direction of globalization. So that seems to be the sequence of causal primacy. The strong national projects first, then the redirection of globalization. But the question that arises with respect to labor in the world order is, to what extent and in what way the open world economy will be predicated on the existence of free labor. Now, what's free labor? So this is a great question and goes to your issue of neoliberalism and labor. So I'm simply focusing now on the most proximate steps, but let's look into the horizon. What would be really free labor? In the 19th century, the liberals and the socialists alike including people like John Stuart Mill and Abraham Lincoln, took the position that economically dependent wage labor was not an acceptable form of free labor. The universal view was that wage labor was a transient and defective form of free labor, retaining many of the characteristics of slavery and serfdom. And it would have to give way over time to the higher forms of free labor, which are self-employment and cooperation. Real self-employment, not self-employment as a disguised form of wage labor. Now, how could that happen? So that's unlikely to happen under the current property regime. There has to be the invention of a series of mechanisms for the decentralization of economic initiative and opportunity. So that, for example, people who have no capital can bid productive resources away from the state or from society. For this change in the conditions under which labor is performed to be feasible. So that would be part of free labor. And then another part of the conception of free labor, looking into the future, would be a radical change in the relation between a worker and a machine. How can labor be free if a worker is made to work as if he were a machine? So in Henry Ford's assembly line, or Adam Smith's pin factory, the worker works as if he were one of his machines. He works by repetitious movements that mimic the movements of his machine. And that's what prevailed under industrial mass production. But we might come to think that the role of a machine is to do for us everything that we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our time, our supreme resource, for the not yet repeatable. We are the anti-machine. Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we express in a formula or an algorithm. And what we can express in a formula or algorithm, we embody in the physical contraction, the machine. And then the combination of the machine and the anti-machine, which is the worker, the person, is much more powerful than either of them alone. So that too is freedom. And so then we have to ask, under what practical institutional conditions could we create the situation in which wage labor gives way to self-employment and cooperation, and the relation of worker to machine is radically transformed? Now, that's not for now. So that's what I said claimed in the first class. It's about a direction. So that's the prophetic element. That's looking far into the future. And somehow, in our way of thinking and acting programmatically, we have to be able to relate the practical and the prophetic, the initial steps to the remote direction. Because the sense of the remote direction reminds us of the purpose and imposes a discipline on our selection of the proximate steps. That is, we have to ask ourselves, does this proximate step, like complementing flex security by a new set of laws to master the reality of precarious employment, does that proximate step bear a plausible relation as part of a sequence that can take us in the direction of this remote future in which free labor becomes really free? And so everywhere we enter the debate, we by different points of departure come to the same imperatives. Well, I've advanced much less than I had imagined, because we're still discussing the unsuccessful and truncated reformation of social democracy, its liberalization. But it doesn't matter, because I think it's just vitally important to have the sense that there's not one formula, there's not one method, that we can enter this world of ideas and possibilities from many different directions and in many different ways. So my impulse, just by my cast of mind, is to systematize. But I remember the remark of the German philosopher and humanist Friedrich Schlegel that two things are fatal to the mind. One is to have a system and the other is not to have one. So somehow these things have to be combined. See you next week.